For the next minute, let's start with a question that every serious history enthusiast and survival-minded viewer eventually asks themselves. How did ordinary soldiers in the Second World War survive months of exposure to brutal weather without the modern synthetics we rely on today? When you look at the gear list of an infantryman, it's tempting to focus on weapons, rations, or uniforms. But buried in the smaller items was a piece of equipment so durable, so resistant to tearing, and so adaptable in the field that veterans talked about it decades later. It wasn't canvas, it wasn't leather, and it absolutely wasn't plastic. It was a military fibre sheet that outperformed most modern tarps, refused to rot, and kept men alive in situations where the difference between staying dry and getting soaked determined whether you lasted the night. The strange part is how few people today even know it existed. That is what makes this topic worth revisiting, because it wasn't just a wartime improvisation. It was a deliberately engineered piece of material science born from shortages, necessity, and the brutal reality of global warfare. And if you work outdoors, camp, build or experiment with old-school survival techniques, there are lessons here worth bringing back. The fibre sheet was created because World War II forced engineers to rethink what durability meant. During the 1930s and early 1940s, militaries across the world were scrambling to replace materials that were becoming scarce. Cotton, canvas and rubber were all being diverted to more critical uses. This pushed engineers to search for alternatives that could withstand field conditions without relying on traditional resources. One of the solutions that emerged was a tightly layered cellulose fibre sheet, bonded with resins and treated with waterproofing compounds. Unlike canvas, which could stretch and sag when soaked, this material held its shape under rain, snow, and constant handling. Unlike leather, it didn't crack or stiffen in the cold. And unlike synthetic tarps today, it didn't shred into strips after the first hard snag. Soldiers used it to reinforce trenches, create improvised shelters, protect equipment from moisture, wrap ammunition crates, and even build temporary roofing. The strength of this fibre sheet came from its structure. By layering the fibres crosswise, engineers created a continual tension network, meaning a tear couldn't simply travel in a straight line. The material would resist the force and redistribute it, a survival trick that gave it a reputation for being almost impossible to rip by hand. The sheet earned its wartime legacy because soldiers could use it for far more than shelter. What makes this material genuinely fascinating is its versatility. When you're reading accounts from frontline logistics crews, engineers or infantrymen, they consistently describe turning this sheet into whatever the moment demanded. If a vehicle broke down in the rain, they laid it underneath to keep tools and parts clean. If trenches flooded, they used it as lining to redirect water. If an outpost needed concealment, they painted it to match the environment and stretched it into a visual screen. Some units even stitched it into windbreaks, pack covers, and field-expedient ground cloths. It absorbed punishment without stretching, sagging, or weakening, which meant soldiers trusted it in situations where normal tarps would have failed. You can test a similar approach today by using stiff, fibre-reinforced sheeting in your own projects. For instance, if you're constructing a long-term outdoor storage area or a permanent survival shelter, layering your barrier material so the fibres run in alternating directions will significantly increase tear resistance. This was exactly the principle behind the World War II sheet, and it shows how historical engineering still applies to modern bushcraft and emergency planning. The durability came from chemistry and field-proofing rather than weight alone. One of the biggest misconceptions about older military gear is that it relied purely on heavy materials. Weight didn't make this fiber sheet strong, its engineered chemistry did. The resins binding the fibers created a composite effect, not unlike early versions of fiberglass. When the sheet was cured and pressed, the result was a material that combined rigidity with flexibility in the right places. The waterproofing treatment was equally important. Instead of soaking the sheet in oil, a method common in earlier decades, World War II engineers used wax emulsions and plant-based compounds that bonded deep into the fibers and resisted washing out. This meant the sheet performed under constant rain, mud and freeze-thaw cycles. If you've ever worked with modern oilcloth or wax canvas, you already understand some of this logic. But the World War II version was superior because it required almost no maintenance and performed well even after repeated folding and scraping. A practical way to apply this today is to maintain your outdoor gear with penetrating waxes rather than surface coatings. When you treat the fibers themselves instead of the exterior, you mimic the World War II approach and get longer-lasting durability. The sheet's long life in storage reveals its biggest engineering advantage. Surplus depots after the war noted something remarkable. These fiber sheets didn't degrade in storage. They didn't rot, unravel, or grow mold the way canvas often does after decades. The resin bonding prevented microbial growth, the waterproofing kept humidity from penetrating, and the cross-woven fibers resisted flattening or splitting. Many reenactors, collectors and restorers still find these sheets today in old crates, sometimes folded for 70 or 80 years, and the material remains usable. This speaks to the mindset of wartime engineering build gear that survives neglect, because neglect is inevitable in war. If you want to bring that principle into your own projects, build using materials that improve under compression and resist moisture over long periods. For example, when creating a permanent ground barrier under a shed or long-term camp, using layered fiber-reinforced sheeting with a resin binder will outperform plastic because plastic becomes brittle, while composite fibers become more stable. The reason this story matters isn't just that the fiber sheet exists, but that its engineering philosophy can be revived. Modern tarps tear along the grain, degrade in UV light, and unravel quickly under abrasion. But the World War II fiber sheet shows that a cross-layered composite with proper waterproofing can last decades with minimal care. For anyone interested in long-term survival planning, historical craftsmanship or heritage technology, this is a piece of gear worth studying. It represents a time when materials were designed to endure hardship, not meet a sales cycle. Even if you're not trying to reproduce the exact sheet, understanding how it worked lets you build or choose equipment that outlasts the modern disposable mindset. If you enjoy deep dives into forgotten engineering, field-tested wartime gear, and survival wisdom pulled straight from history, make sure to subscribe and share this guide. There's a lot more worth exploring, and every episode brings another piece of the past back into the present.